Okay, and now we can go ahead and get started. All right, so let's dive right into today's topic is keeping escrow alive, right? So preventing a cancellation from the residential purchase agreement. So we're going to talk about buyer sides, seller sides, contingencies, notice to perform the DCE, which is the demand to close, request the repairs, extensions, and then obviously cancellations, right? So this particular presentation is a little bit different in a sense is we're going to go through every element of what can happen right from the beginning towards the middle, and then obviously at the very end, you may still be in a situation where the deal may still fall apart, right? Buyer has released contingencies and now something changes, right? So I want to make sure that I provide you with the insights of my personal opinion in dealing with so many different transactions that I see on a regular basis, but more so holding your composure, right? And just knowing how to maneuver and navigate it to the finish line because the goal here is trying to maintain a lot of moving parts as we get to the finish line. So today's topic is going to be, how to maneuver, how to handle, and overcome some of the challenges that, sometimes happens when you're dealing with a real estate deal in escrow. So your job is not just to open up the escrow, right? Here's what I see. Great agents get offers accepted. Skilled agents keep the contract together when things get difficult. So we all want, right? We all want all of our transactions to go as smooth as possible, right? When you have a dynamic opposing agent, a great escrow inspection companies that you're dealing with, and you're navigating, you want everyone to align and to all be on the same page, right? And for the most part, most of our transactions are smooth, most of the time, right? But every once in a while, we'll have a transaction that goes sideways, right? Immediately. And that's a problem. How, as real estate professionals, how do we handle that, right? How do we navigate this? Well, you definitely want to seek advice and help, through leadership to be able to navigate. Some of the issues that we see is inspections, finance, appraisal, insurance disclosures, title, HOA, solar or lease equipment repairs, delays in close of escrow, buyer remorse, right? Buyers get the cold feet, right? They're excited. You identify, you negotiate, you open escrow, and then they decide, oh my gosh, they get a mortgage shock, right? It's like our monthly payment is going to be this when our rental was this, and now we have to pay more money. So they'll get that buyer's remorse. And also sellers get frustrated, right? So sometimes when there's too much of a delay, right? And I deal with a lot of that stuff on a regular basis, right? Well, what kills more transaction is the actual problem, and but it's knowing how to manage it as well, right? And this is where you want to get additional support to help you navigate. Look, a lot of us that have been in the industry for some time, we see things from the outside looking in, where most agents see things from the inside looking out. So their perspective is a little bit more narrow. Not that they're any better or worse. It's just they're so entrenched in the situation and the emotional chaos of it that sometimes they need just a backup or additional eyes to see or identify how they can maneuver this to get out of this little dilemma, right? Because most times agents kill the deals, right? Because they get so involved in it and they get their personal feelings in it, and now it compromises the transaction. So we just need to know how to maneuver. Don't take it personal. Let the buyers and the sellers dispute and iron it out together. And guess what? Sometimes it gets ironed out where it's a win-win and you continue with the initial process. Now, also, I want to keep this in mind because it's important for all of you to understand that sometimes it just doesn't make any sense. It really just doesn't make any sense for the deal to stick because maybe they don't qualify. Maybe the buyer is just not being cooperated, right? There's so many things that can happen. But I also want you to understand when you understand the ins and outs of the purchase agreement, It's your questions and your answers, right? It really gives you the timelines of what you need to do as a real estate agent, what the buyer needs to do, what the seller needs to do, what the escrow company needs to do, and the entire transaction to get it to the finish line, right? This is why the purchase agreement is vital and important for your sake and for the peace of mind of the transaction to continue going to the finish line, right? So the purchase agreement talks in many variables, right? It talks about loan, which is under paragraph 3L, appraisal, which is under 3L2, investigations, insurance, seller documentations, preliminary title, common interest disclosures, lease, liens, and items, and the seller or buyer's property, right? If the buyer has to sell their property, but wants to buy their property, but they need the proceeds of that property to sell in order to qualify to purchase a new property, right? So there's many moving parts to this, and our job is just to stay calm, stay composed. Okay, everything is going to be okay. So never tell me contingencies are due. Tell me which contingencies, which paragraph, and what date, right? So you got to be very specific because again, just because someone says, hey, your contingencies are due, you got to release this. Okay, get into the meat and potato of the circumstances. Well, one, you should know what contingencies need to be released. Is it appraisal? Is it investigations? Is it insurance? Is it the loan, right? Once you understand how to, maneuver this ship, right, it's easier for you to ultimately have control of the narrative and get it to the finish line, right? Because we want to close this deal. We want to get paid for services render, right? So this is where your professional expertise come into play. So a deadline passing is not the same as a contingency being removed. Under paragraph AJ, buyer must remove the contingency or cancel within the appropriate period, right? If the buyer doesn't act, seller remedy is to send what's called a notice to buyer to perform, right? Not to declare automatic non-contingent situation because none of them is automatic. Okay, so I want you to understand the ins and outs and how that works is because there's been clever or what they believe are clever agents trying to say it's automatically, right? No, you still have to go through the proper channels to release it by a documentation that allows the buyer to know exactly that they acknowledge, they understand, and they approve by signing and executing the form of releasing a specific contingency. I say this quite often, and I'll continue saying this every single time, folks, is that a contingency is like a wall. Your buyer's money deposit is here, and then you have these walls that protect that earnest deposit. Every time a buyer releases one of these contingencies is releasing a wall, and that means that the seller has closer and closer opportunity to ultimately get the buyer's deposit once the buyer releases any and all contingencies, right? And that can happen. This is why the buyer has to have some skin in the game. If you're going to tie up my property for 30 days, right? I want to see that you are committed to it. I'm not just going to take your offer with no skin in the game by not having a deposit in play, right? So, and I've seen circumstances where I'm just baffled. I'm just surprised that the deposit is a very minimal deposit and they accept it, right? So there's really not much skin in the game for the seller to go after because whatever they accept is the amount that they can go after for damages. So be purposeful and be intentional in how you're navigating this. Thank you so much. I appreciate you. You're awesome. One of my best students. So what agents assume, right? If the deadline passes, the buyer doesn't act, the contingency automatically falls. So let's give you a kind of a scenario, right? You're in a offer acceptance, right? You represent the buyer. You know that you kept all of your contingencies in place for 17 days, which is the default amount, right? And now 17 days is there. Your mind, you're telling your buyer, oh yeah, it's automatically released because it's the 17 day. Well, that's not the way the contract works, okay? Because what happens if you're now in the 18th or 19th day of the escrow period, right? most agents, surprisingly, and it just baffles me that they think that it automatically gets released. Doesn't work that way. Okay. So know your contracts, know and understand how it works, because that is your defense mechanism that allows you to protect your client's best interest, but more so the buyer's earnest deposit. But what the RPA says, the seller must deliver the notice to perform. Only then must the buyer remove the contingency or cancel. So that contingency is a safe haven as well for the buyer, because the buyer also has their time period to do what's called their due diligence, right? Do whatever you want with the property, meaning do your inspections. That can be a general inspection, that can be plumber, electrical, roof, whatever inspections they want to do. That's during their time period. That's the 17-day default on the residential purchase agreement, right? But that's also negotiable. You can reduce that contingency period from 17 down to 10, down to 12, down to 5, or you can also increase it from 17 days up to 20 days, 22 days, 23. That's the beautiful thing and the dynamics of the contracts, that it allows us, right? Allows us to maneuver the negotiations regarding the protection of your buyer's deposit. Okay. The distinguish can change in its entirely, meaning, you know, you can negotiate this, right? And say to the seller, look, in good faith, we're submitting an offer. We're reducing our contingencies, right? Because we want our offer to be accepted. But it's not automatically, right? The buyer will still have to release that as part of their condition, right? It's the receipt and the proof. Mr. and Mrs. Seller, here's my proof that I release, the physical inspection. Here's the proof of releasing the appraisal, right? That's your documentation that says that you've already delinquished that particular contingency, because you're still in the position to move forward. The buyer still wants and has interest in the property. That's why they're pushing closer and closer to the finish line. But again, let's turn the tables around. Now you're the listing agent representing the seller. You want to keep tight contingencies in place and make sure that the buyer is doing what they need to do, right? And not drag your feet. Because if you don't receive the contingency release, then you need to call the agent. Okay. I would first say call the agent before you send a notice to perform. You know how many times agents get upset when you send them and slap them with the contingency removal, okay, or an automatically notice to perform, I should say, okay. So do the right thing, in my opinion, and this is again my opinion and my opinion only, but do at least a courtesy call to the listing agent, okay, and say something to this nature. Hey there, this is Simon, and just wanted to let you know that your client's contingency is scheduled for tomorrow to be released. Will we be expecting that contingency removal by tomorrow? Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. I'll definitely get the buyers to sign off on the contingency removal. Wonderful. Thank you very much. Okay. Because you don't want to send a notice to perform, right? Because a lot of buyers agents, they try to stay under the radar. Okay. And the reason they want to stay under the radar is because if they can protect the contingencies, they're going to do it to the very end. And trust me, I've seen circumstances and situations where the buyer never released any contingencies. Now, good thing they closed the deal, but imagine if the buyer decided to cancel and the buyer retained all of their contingencies in place. And they says, I'm going to cancel. The seller has no recourse, really, because the contract defines and it says that the buyer must release all contingencies in order for the seller to ultimately go after liquidated damages, right? Because the buyer breached the contract, did not perform. This is the reason we have a deposit in the escrow, right? That didn't happen. That's a problem. Guess what's going to happen? The seller is going to be very, very upset at you because you're not protecting your client's best interest on that flip side. So be very careful, but also be mindful of your position. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. Do not blindly remove contingencies. Okay. Protection. You see that thing on the very left? What is that? right here. That's a shield, right? That's what I said. You got the shield protection when it comes to your earnest deposit, right? So under paragraph 8I, buyer has no obligation to remove contingency unless seller has provided all required documentation, reports, and disclosures and information pertaining to that specific contingency. Meaning, I am not going to release my physical inspections or seller disclosure, right, until I've done my due diligence, right? Let's just say, for example, I never received the seller disclosures. Why in the heck would I release that as a condition when I don't know what the seller is saying about the property, right? So even though, well, Simon, and I've heard it before, Simon, it's 17 days or 12 days. I have to release that, but we haven't received the seller disclosures. Do I need to release that contingency? What should be your answer? No, of course. Why would you? Because let's say you release that as a condition, and now the seller sends you disclosures, and they say that the sewer line needs to be replaced, and it's going to cost you $40,000. That's a big problem, right? Very big problem. So before you do so, make sure you have all of the proper documentations before you do so. If buyer removes contingency without adequate understanding, buyer is acting against the advice of the broker and the agent. Okay. So they can do whatever they want, and a lot of investors will. They buy sight unseen. They know exactly what their plan of action is, and they're okay to release contingencies. But for your protection and your protection only, you still want to document it and make sure that you at least divulge that, hey, I know you're a very savvy professional. You know the ins and outs on how real estate contracts work, and you're buying the property in its as is condition, right? Knowing that there's a lot of issues, and you want to go with the elements of releasing all of your contingencies, which you have your right to do so. But I would also have just a disclaimer protection saying, hey, we advise you that that may not be the best practice, is because I've even seen investors do stupid things. Stupid things. They release all contingencies and now they're backpedaling because they want to cancel because they realize, oh my gosh, I did the sewer inspection and I realized that it's just going to be too much. Now I want a price reduction. Does the seller have to give you a price reduction after you release all contingencies? Absolutely not. Okay. So then the buyer wants to back out, but they want now says, well, I didn't know, I didn't want to release all my contingencies. That's your protection that allows you to know that, hey, I've explained to you, the risk involved, even though you're a very sophisticated investor, not to release all contingencies automatically in the very beginning when you submit an offer. But hey, buyers do crazy stuff. And even people that have experience, I just like, okay, protect yourself. The objective isn't to get a CR sign, a contingency removal. Our objective is to make sure your buyers understand what they're giving up before they sign, right? Because remember, that shield protection is the buyer's deposit, right? And it can be very significant amount of money, right? I've seen deposits in excess of over 50,000 and $80,000, right? Depending on the price point will dictate the amount of deposit that's going to be in escrow. The higher the price point, the higher the deposit, and the higher the risk as well, right? So be mindful when you represent either party in this situation. Loan and appraisal and insurance are different, right? So I want to be kind of clear on this, right? Because one is not the other. Everything is separate, right? The loan is separate from the appraisal. The appraisal is separate from the insurance, right? So under the residential purchase agreement, under paragraph 8A loan, 8B appraisal, and 8D insurance, it has different reasons behind that particular contingency, right? So failure of the appraise or lender insurance requirement does not resurface the loan contingent if the buyer otherwise qualifies, right? Because let's just say, for example, right, you go in there and it's a cash offer, right? but you still retain the appraisal, right? Now, you don't have any finance involved, so it eliminates a lot of the red tape, right? But the essence of the situation is that can a buyer still have an appraisal done on a cash offer? The answer is yeah, they can, because I want to know that I'm not overpaying for a property, right? But the seller may say, well, you're buying it cash. Why would you need an appraisal done, right? There's no conditions. You have no underwriter scenarios. The seller may be in a position that they want you to release the appraisal contingency, but you can hold that and says, look, I'm willing to buy this property. I'm willing to go cash, but I want to retain the right to get my independent appraisal done because I want to know if I'm paying more than I should, right? And the beautiful thing is, I've seen situations where cash deals, they do an appraisal and that property appraises for a lot less. That's a negotiation element as well, right? That gives you the opportunity for you to renegotiate terms based on the appraisal. And now you have documentation and proof that if you're going to request a price reduction based on the appraisal, here's the appraisal report from an independent appraiser that did the work, and then that gives you kind of a pool to be able to negotiate with the seller, right? And if the seller says, nope, you know what, we're not going to reduce the price, then the buyer has the right to cancel and move on, right? But usually you'll try to work, depending again on what the appraisal, right? If it's, a couple $1,000 difference, you might be able, but if it's in the 100,000s, that may be significant that the seller may say, I don't know. I'm not sure if I want to go that low with the appraised value, right? So that goes for insurance, right? Especially right now, properties that are in various locations, especially in the hills or mountain areas where insurance is really difficult to insure. A lot of insurance companies are leaving California because, with all of the fires that transpired several years back, the Palisades, the Pasadena area where we saw tons of homes, unfortunately, go up in smoke, right? So a lot of insurances were not paying because of the significance and the cost to rebuild, the material cost, and more so the labor cost, right, to get contractors out there to rebuild properties, right? So be mindful when you're negotiating and navigating this is like, do we have all of our ducks in row, right? Do we have the insurance in place? Because if you wait to the very end, that may delay the process of you closing the deal. And I've seen this firsthand. If you represent a buyer, right, the first things you should start already doing is your general inspection. Okay. Immediately set up a schedule for a home inspection. Number two, tell the buyer to start now looking for insurance, homeowners insurance immediately, because it may be a situation. I know there was one of our agents on a property, a condominium up in the hill. And with all of the issues happening up in the hill right now with the landslides, right? A lot of insurance companies are not insuring properties, right? And it may not be anywhere near where the active landslides are, but the premium can be significant, paying double or even triple. And that to a buyer is like, yeah, that is expensive. My current insurance is only this, and our house is a lot bigger than the one we're buying, right? But it all depends on where the area is at too, as well, right? So be mindful of these circumstances because these are some of the most vital positions that once you release this as a condition, there's no going back, right? You're not going to release insurance until you know that the insurance carrier is willing to insure this particular property. Okay. Buyers remove appraisal. Appraisal comes in 50,000 low. Buyer says we still have our loan contingency, right? So they cannot use that as a position, right? If you release the appraisal, okay, that doesn't give you a right to exit because you still have your loan. Well, Simon, I cannot get my approval. Okay, I cannot get my approval because the appraisal is a lot less and I don't have the means or the funds to come in with the difference, right? The buyer cannot use that as an ammunition to say, hey, I'm going to cancel, right? Because I cannot get the loan. Well, a savvy licensed listing agent will say, well, did you get the appraisal? Yeah, we got the appraisal. What the appraisal come in? Well, the appraisal came in a lot less, right? And the seller doesn't want to come in with the difference, right? So because of that, I don't have the difference to pay. So a buyer cannot use that as a way to exit, right? There might still be damages that the seller may incur. So this is like, look, I understand that, but you release the appraisal contingency knowing that there's risk. And because of that, I still want some of your earnest deposit. Okay. Well, Simon, wait a minute. You just said that, as long as the buyer has their contingencies in place, the seller cannot technically go after the deposit. Look, if there's a dispute, there's nothing any real estate agent, real estate brokers, managers, team leaders, broker or record can do to minimize and say, this is what you need to do. Because once there's a dispute between a buyer and the seller, that's between them. I cannot force the buyer to do what they wanted or what we should suggest to do as much as the seller as well, right? So understand that sometimes it's just best for the buyer and the seller to iron it out together, right? If that means going through a mediation, right? Just this past Monday, I was at the Pacific West Association of Realtors out in Anaheim with one of our agents on a mediation case. And what's so ironic, kind of similar situation, we represented the buyer. The buyer went and released all contingencies. The buyer had buyer's remorse, wasn't happy with the rate they were getting, and their mortgage payment was not comfortable for them. So they decided, I want to cancel. And we were trying to navigate that conversation as, look, you released all, you're going to lose your deposit. We were just trying to help her understand the pros and cons. And she was still adamant, I don't like the property. So she gave us the song and dance. So we had no choice but to reach out to the listing agent and just explain the buyer decided to cancel. And the seller says, okay, not a problem. They sent out the cancellation, releasing the earnest deposit to the seller, which they're entitled to. They were literally entitled. Buyer released everything. Buyer at the end decided to cancel. So the seller says, no problem, draft the cancellation, releasing the 3% or the amount of earnest deposit to the seller. Buyer says, nope, I ain't going to release. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of money to give someone that one, we're not taking the property. And two, why is the seller getting so much money? Okay. So we had to go back and explain the circumstances, and English is not her first language. So I guess the concept and understanding of how real estate is practiced here is different than in her country. So after going through all that, they were still adamant and says, look, at first she says, I'm okay. Let them have the money. And then the boyfriend or fiance steps up, says, no, we're not going to release it. This is ridiculous. Then they start pointing fingers. Well, the buyer's agent told us, and you should go after the buyer, right? The buyer's agent, right? And then that's when I had to come in and step in and says, look, so I needed to kind of understand the elements of what happened and led us to where we're at right now, because now they were threatening to point fingers. You were the person that advised me to release all the contingency because I didn't understand. Okay. But who signed these documentation? Who initial? Whose signature? Whose date on these documentation? At the buyer, right? So be mindful and be very careful, because when they go sideways, and when they go sideways really quick, they're going to point fingers. Okay. And they don't care. So ultimately, we ended up I ended up talking to their broker as well, trying to find a resolution. We couldn't come to a resolution, so they ultimately escalated it to a mediation. And it's just because the buyer says, nope, we're not going to release the deposit to the seller. So we had no choice. That stopped everything. So the next step is either party can mediate this. And if both don't, that money stays in escrow for a very long time until they come to a resolution. Now, all of you know that the buyer ultimately breached the contract and released all contingencies. Therefore, the seller has every right for damages here, right? So as you can see how the story is going, yeah, it looks like the seller is going to be able to uh, uh, get the buyer's deposit, right? They're entitled to it, right? On black and white, it sounds fairly right. But the essence, when the mediator, and this is the key, ladies and gentlemen, because you have to have a great mediator, a really good mediator. When we got there, we met up with the buyers, and it was myself, the agent, and the buyers. And then immediately in front of us, we didn't even know it was the sellers. So we were introducing ourselves, hi, good morning, and all this stuff, not knowing. I didn't know that there were sellers because we were in the lobby room. And then all of a sudden, the mediator comes out, introduces himself. I will be mediating this case. We're going to go into the big conference rooms. And I don't know, most of you probably have never been to the PWR in Anaheim. It's a big conference room. It's like a boiler room. It's a huge, huge table with maybe 20 chairs around. Anyways, we go in there and I noticed that the people who are in front of us, they go in and already there sitting. It's like, oh, that must be the sellers or the agents. So we immediately go in there. They're right in front of us, the seller. And then it was myself, the agent, and also the buyers, and then the mediator. The agent, surprisingly for the sellers, wasn't there, and the broker was running late. So the mediator ultimately just started talking, says, look, the whole purpose of all of this. So we went through the song and dance on all this situation, you know, and they were questioning us, right? Well, you released all contingencies, and he highlighted the contingency removal and all of what it says so it could pinpoint because obviously the mediator is a neutral individual. Okay. He's not, or she is not there to say you're wrong, you're right, you're wrong, you're right. None of that. He's neutral, she is neutral to come to a resolution. That's really what it boils and what it stems, right? It just come to a resolution. Whatever resolution that both can agree is how we draft the conclusion to this case. So after back and forth, we kind of understand the basis. And I love the tactic that the mediator to have both of us in there. So he allowed the seller to spill the beans and just say everything that they wanted to say. And then he paused and says, okay, tell us your side of the story, buyers. And then the buyer said the reason behind it. And guess what? They looked at the agent and says, well, our agent was the one that told us to release all contingencies, including the loan, right? So then in our defense, I had to intervene on this because again, my job is what? Is to protect my agent, right? And I'm there as part of this process. So I stepped in and ultimately give our side of the story and, a very compelling position in my approach to protect and defend, but more so also, regardless of how they feel about the circumstances, I was still protecting and defending my clients, which is the buyer and also the agent. Okay. Because remember, we have sellers there that are hearing all this. So I don't want more ammunition on them to use against us when we're fighting here and they're pointing fingers. But the tactic was here because the mediator is a very savvy individual with many years of experience. He knows that sometimes exposing everything will allow people to now say, okay, we have an angle and an approach that we can navigate this, right? And that's the beautiful thing about mediation. Well, surprisingly, after back and forth, the mediator said, "Hey, it's Mr. and Mrs. Seller," and finally the broker came. Let's go to the other room. Okay, so he got the people to the other room, and it was just the buyer, myself, the agent, and then the mediator back and forth. And the mediator asked us, "Well, how much of that deposit are you willing to give?" And then the buyers look at each other. It's like, we don't want to give any of that money. The meteor says, well, that's not going to cut it. Then this is just a waste of time. So why did we even start this if you're not willing? You guys are in a predicament here, right? And you guys released all contingencies, therefore, give me something to work with. I cannot go back and say they're not willing to give any money. What are they going to say? Well, then what's the point of having a mediation, right? So through the frustration, the buyer decided, well, we'll start with $5,000. Give them $5,000. $5,000. Now, bear in mind the deposit was, I think $20,000. 20,000. Okay, are you sure 5,000? They say, yeah, 5,000. So the mediator went. He said, okay, opens the door, goes. He's there for only a few minutes. He comes back. He comes and sits and looks at us and says, I have good news, but I have bad news. The bad news is they're not accepting your 5,000. But the good news is that the sellers are willing to take less than what the actual amount is. And that amount is $12,000. Here where I'm going with this, ladies and gentlemen, because remember the earnest deposit is 20,000. Okay. And theoretically speaking, the seller has every right to go after the full 20,000. But we also have sellers that understand the elements of diffusing and ultimately coming to a resolution. One, they're still going to sell their property. Okay. They're going to be able to sell their property to another buyer, have another deposit in. So those are kind of the avenues and how you have to look at the bigger picture, right? So they came back with the 12,000 and I knew where this was going. Again, this is a very savvy mediator. The buyers looked at each other, looked at us. It's like, in my country, $5,000 is a lot of money. A lot of money. I don't want to give any more money than I should. I'm just upset that we have to go through all this. I says, I understand that. But look, this will be behind you. Otherwise, your money is tied in escrow. We cannot force or ask them to release the deposit until you guys come to a resolution. So they looked at each other and said, we'll do 8,000. And the mediator says, 8,000? I don't think 8,000 is going to work. Why don't we go with half? Half of what? Half of 12 or half of 20? Half of 20. So you're saying $10,000. Yeah. I can get the sellers to probably agree to that. You're saying they will agree? I didn't say. I'm just saying I might be able to have the sellers agree to that. Fine. Goes in there, spends no more than 3 to 5 minutes, comes back. I have good news and bad news. What do you want to hear? I want to hear the good news. Well, they agree. They agree to the 50% of the deposit. Gary and myself, we were talking. That was the agent. We looked at each other and says, this is great. This is a good resolution, right? Because remember, the seller was in a position to go after the entire deposit. And, in these circumstances, to even win 50% of your deposit is a win for the buyers, in my opinion. So the buyer said, okay, we agree to the terms and go ahead. So the bad news is the buyers would have to agree to it or not. We're still in the process. So this is, we agree. So let's just go ahead and sign off on it. The bad news would have been if they didn't agree to that, Exactly. So the story basically was that we came to a resolution. We got a letter from the mediator, and then that's the proof that we sent to the escrow, and escrow was able to now have instructions from both the buyer and the seller that they mutually agree to release 50% to the seller, 50% to the buyer. Done. So remember, even though the black and white of the contract, which we still follow, ladies and gentlemen, we follow that. If we can at least come to a resolution, then great. If not, they would have to escalate it through a mediation and they would have to start the process. And sometimes getting that buyer, getting that seller to that position is hard because then you have to add additional paperwork and summary, and then you have to pay to get a mediator to mediate this. So there's a lot of moving parts that ultimately get you to a mediation, right? But that's always going to be the best case. Now, mediation is one part, arbitration is a whole different element. Okay. Because a mediator is just to mediate it, and arbitration is if we cannot come to a resolution on a mediation, then the next step would be is to arbitrate. Okay. And an arbitration is more like a court hearing where there's one or maybe three panelists that are listening to the case. You go in there with an attorney if you want. Um, you can have witnesses, exhibits. You can cross-examine the opposing party. So you can say to the seller, well, Mr. Smith, tell me what happened, right? And they have to tell us because it's like a court hearing, literally. You have a panelist listening to the case, but the decision is not upon the buyer and the seller in an arbitration. The decision ultimately is between the arbitrator's final conclusion of proof, burden of proof, meaning who has the most relevant proof in this particular case. That's more of the black and white. And if we would have escalated it to an arbitration because the buyer and the seller could not mediate, the black and white of it would have been is probably the seller would have been entitled to the full 20% of the money. End story. Because the proof is there. So those are some of the situations and scenarios that we have. Steve, you had a question?
But mediation also, it's mediation is an agreement between buyer and seller.
Yeah.
However, also under mediation, even if there was a conclusion reached at the mediation, because it's non-binding, that either party still has the right to quote unquote change their mind from what was agreed upon at that mediation, if after they, contemplated and said, on reflection, I'm not quite as happy as I thought I would be. I think we now need to escalate it, either go back to mediation and or escalate it to an arbitration.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's not binding, it is an agreement between the two parties, but it is not, they can still even change their mind even after they came to an agreement.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Good point. All right. Well, let's go ahead and continue. So paragraph 8C, paragraph 12, buyer must complete investigation and deliver complete copies of the report to the seller by the contractor deadline or 3 days after receipt, whichever is later. So part of, again, the elements of the purchase agreement, if the buyer is requesting any type of repairs, any type of credit in lieu of repairs, or a price reduction, do you think it would be to the buyer's interest to also provide proof of that request to the seller? The answer is yeah. If you're going to be asking for something, show me the proof of why you want this. Otherwise, I'm not going to take face value just because you're just throwing a number and hope it sticks, that you are asking for $20,000, right? Show me the proof, right? The proof is the inspections that you can do, right? Your buyers can do, right? Because that again allows the buyer the opportunity to kind of kick the tires, right? When you're checking a used vehicle, right? It gives you an opportunity. It says, okay, what are some of the biggest concerns I should be looking for in a property that I'm going to buy, right? Because a house is a big investment. And you don't know what you don't know. You have not lived in the property, so you can't always take the seller's face value of what they ultimately put on the documentation, which is the seller disclosures, right? So in essence, the way you do this is by the buyer going out and getting inspections. That's a roof, that's a foundation inspection, a sewer inspection, plumbing, electrical, HVAC, termite permits, square footage, boundaries, environmental, any other type of specialized things, maybe air quality, mold. There's all of these inspections that your client can do in order to satisfy themselves to the overall condition of the property. Does that make sense? We did the general inspection. Is that a complete investigation? No. A general inspection is just what it is, a general inspection. That general inspection also is going to give you a lot more information. I'm going to give you a scenario. We have a inspection company, and this is a duplex. The general inspection, which is a reputable company, does their inspection. And part of that inspection was also a sewer line inspection, meaning they would throw a line with a camera to go look at the integrity of the sewer line, right? But when we got the inspection report back, we noticed that it was a duplex, that there was only one video. Well, apparently the general inspection didn't do the second sewer line through the second property. So, but on that inspection report, he noticed that there were some issues with it, that there was water just there. It wasn't flowing. So that put the buyer in a position as maybe we should do additional inspection. And the good thing is that the agent said and advised, maybe we need to get an inspection by a professional plumber. So they ended up getting a plumber, and to their surprise, is when they looked at the second house and they ran the line, they found that there was rocks and a water hose inside the sewer line. Okay. So now that's significant. Well, that amount is in the thousands and thousands of dollars to replace. But imagine if you would have not done that inspection, the buyer would have closed, and now the back unit, when they're taking a shower or, their dishes, it backflows. That's a problem. And then they do an inspection and realize, oh my gosh, the sewer line is cracked. The sewer line is backed up, right? That could be a significant issue. But if you come across that from the very beginning while you're in the investigation period, it's easier to now negotiate with the seller to either repair it, give credit in lieu of repairs, price reduction, or cancel the deal and let someone else deal with that problem, right? But it's to the seller's advantage too to take care of that, because if we don't, as a buyer, buy it, someone else is also going to have that same issue. And now it's considered material fact, meaning we divulge these reports. This is now new material that you might have not been aware, but you're now aware. You cannot disguise that or hide it from any potential buyer that's interested, because now they have remedy to sue the seller for non-disclosures. So be mindful and careful about that situation. Buyers say, I want out, don't immediately cancel, right? Now, a lot of experienced agents deal with this on a regular basis. Okay. And don't be in a position to give in so quickly. Okay. Because it may be an emotional save, but back in their mind, they may still be interested in the property. Don't give into it immediately, saying, "Okay, I'm going to draft the cancellation." So go into the core of the conversation and go with this motion. What specifically changed, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer? If that issue could be resolved on acceptable terms, would that give you a reconsideration about the property? You see how the flow of that conversation changes, instead of saying, yeah, you're right. You know what? Let's just go ahead and cancel, right? Because it's your time. You spend a lot of energy, time getting the buyer to this position. that means you're back to square one again. Finding, negotiating, due diligence periods in hopes that the second property closes, right? But now you're in escrow. How can you maneuver this and help them get to the finish line? Because when you give an approach differently, right? You're a consultant, you're an advisor, okay, guiding them through the initial process. Now you're not going to recommend. They have to make their ultimate decision and how they want to go through this because I'm not the one buying the property. I'm not the one making the mortgage payment. So, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, tell me what you'd like me to do. Okay. Let them tell you exactly what they want. And your job is just to navigate that because you want the peace of mind that they don't want. You don't want them to ultimately point fingers at you because you didn't follow their directions. Okay. What is the problem? Is there any active contractual contingencies that apply, right? What would solve the problem? What does the client actually want, right? Once you get intentional and understand and not get yourself in the emotional elements of it, because again, it's an emotional process for the buyers and for the sellers. And they're relying heavily on your expertise. But if you're breaking down, it's not going to show well. You need to compose yourself and be that professional, right? And help them get them to whatever that finish line. If that means canceling, okay, so be it, right? You cannot do anything about it and go with the flow of it. But at least know that you still have your clients that now you're looking into helping them with another property. If the client has made an informed decision to exercise an existing cancellation right, that is different. The goal is not to trap someone into escrow, right? Don't force them because there's a lot of pushy agents, right? Understand your boundaries, but also understand that if the buyer is adamant, okay, you know what? There's nothing that you can do, and don't put more in strain into that because that's going to put more distance into your buyer because they're seeing the commission is your priority than their best interest. Be careful about that. So the request of repair is negotiation tool. It's not a shopping list. Okay, so property deliver as is in its present physical condition as accepted, subject to contractual terms and anything otherwise agreed. That's what the contract says. All properties are sold in its as is condition. Okay. Seller is only required to make repairs required by the agreement or sequentially agreed upon. Okay. Safety, systems, material cost. Don't negotiate 37 cosmetic items if three issues determine whether your buyer stays in the transaction, right? Don't just say, we're going to ask the seller to fix everything on this home inspection report. Get to the core of what is more important to the client. It may not be all of the other stuff because maybe the husband is a very handy man and can handle most of the little stuff, right? Get to the bigger stuff, the things that make sense that may be a deal breaker. Okay. Then negotiate based on that. Does that make sense? Any questions regarding this? Seller wants to cancel, buyer starts where? Okay. So starts here. Ask the question why. Is it deposit not delivered? Verification not provided? Contingencies not removed? Contractual obligations unmet? Failure to disclose? Okay. Which cancellation form do I send, right? What's the reason behind it? Because the cancellation has specific language in there that says and gives instruction on what your buyer's wishes are. Because you cannot say after you release all contingencies, the seller decided to change their mind and wants to cancel, right? And now puts that as part of their condition is they change their mind, they want to cancel, but they want their deposit back. Okay, that's a no-no. One, you're going to look like an agent that doesn't know what they're doing. Two is you're not being rational about the circumstances, right? Remember, I always would put the buyer in a position. What if you were the seller in this circumstances? What would you do, or how would you feel about this? Right? I don't think I would feel right, right? Exactly. So let's do the right thing, right? So keep that in mind. Identifying the failure before selecting the remedy, right? Understand the core of what the reason and their motivation of why they're doing what they're doing will give you a better position and how you can navigate this to help diffuse or ultimately of resolution. Because no one wants to be in a position of losing their deposit, right? Do you want to lose your deposit? Do you want to lose your deposit? Right? You don't want to lose your deposit. But if you're not educating your clients and understanding the risk involved, they're going to start pointing fingers, and then that's where it gets a little sticky, right? One, they may put a bad review on you. Two, they may escalate it to a complaint with the Department of Real Estate. And three, they may ask for damages. I lost $30,000 because of you giving me wrong advice. Whoa, wait, what? No. And now we may have to escalate it to an insurance claim, because now they're seeking, damages, right? Not a position you want to be, in my opinion.
It all starts with this, in my opinion, dealing with the condition of the home and the home inspection is something that I know I dwell on from the very beginning, even with the initial buyer consultation, talking about the importance that when you're buying a home today, you're buying it as is, subject to the inspection. And during that inspection, we're focusing on the big rocks of that inspection. Again, re-emphasizing, I can't tell you, I probably say the phrase to the buyer at least 5 to 6 times of understanding you're not buying a new home, you are buying a used home. The purpose of the investigation is not to make a used home new. It's to identify the major rocks that could be issues of the major components, plumbing, heating, electrical, roof, foundation. And I probably repeat that 5 to 6 times from the time we then get to the request for repairs.
That's right.
Okay. Yeah. And that significantly helps. Okay, because you're able to bring the buyer back from when they read every revenue report. Okay. Remember, we're only focusing on the big rocks, and I can't tell you how many times I've heard, oh, that's right, oh, that's right, oh, that's right.
Yeah. Yeah, no, without a doubt.
And here is the key,
100%. Yeah. Communication is the key. Thank you for sharing. All right, so let's talk about the NBP and the NSP. Does everyone know what that means? Notice to buyer to perform and notice to seller to perform. The 2-day rule, right? Must be in writing, must be signed by the buyer or seller, must give the other party at least 2 days after delivery or until the contractual time, whichever is later. Okay. Cannot be delivered earlier than the 2 days before the scheduled performance day. Okay. So let's just say, what's today's date? The 14th, right? And today is the date of release of the contingencies. Now, based on this statement here, can I send a notice to perform to the buyer on the 12th of August, 2 days earlier?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. If we have someone that says yes, someone here says no. Okay. The answer is yes. If you read what it says, cannot be delivered earlier than the 2 days before the scheduled performance day, meaning, yeah, you can send the notice to perform to the buyer 2 days prior the performance of that particular contingency. So that means that on today's date at 11:59 p.m., the buyer has to release that as a condition, and if they don't, your seller has the right to cancel. Now, most people think that they have to wait till today to send the notice to perform, which in most cases I see that happen quite often, where they send the notice to perform today on the 17th day, but that now gives the buyer 2 additional days to release that as a condition. Meaning that now, if today is given the notice to perform, today is considered 0 days of a 2 day period. Tomorrow would be one, Sunday would be two. Now, the problem here is because it falls on a weekend, that 2 day reverts to the next calendar day, which is a business day on Monday. So theoretically speaking, the buyer has till Monday at 11:59 to release that particular contingency based on this scenario. So if you play it right, you want to send the notice to perform 2 days prior, so that way the buyer doesn't have 3 more days to release that. You see where I'm going with this? Know your calendar days, and I promise you, you keep tight conditions in place. Not that it's right or wrong, okay, but that's just what the contract stipulates, okay? Bad notice, no cancellation leverage, right? Because what if you have a buyer in a backup that you want to get into contract, but now you're lingering because you gave the buyer an additional 3 days to release that. So technically, they have to almost Tuesday to release that as a condition, where you can be canceling with this buyer, opening up with another buyer, right? So those are the advantages and disadvantages of the contingency removal. And it goes both ways, ladies and gentlemen, meaning if the seller doesn't perform, then yeah, the buyer has the right. And if they don't perform, you have the right to cancel. And if you're sending the notice to perform in a seller and they don't perform, you have the right to cancel, but you also have the right to your full deposit back as well. Okay, so keep that in mind.
Hey, Simon,
Yes, sir.
I have a question along the same line. Um, if during the negotiation period, prior to acceptance of the offer, can the seller write in that, for example, if the contingency is not removed by the 17th day, this contract is automatically canceled?
No, no, it doesn't work that way.
Not allowed?
Mm.
Okay.
Yep. You had a question, Steve?
No.
Oh, okay. Got it. All right, let's continue. All right, buyers can notice seller to know the notice to seller to perform. So under paragraph 14D, if seller fails to remove, excuse me, if it should be buyers to if seller, it should be buyers, and I apologize for the typo. If buyers fail to remove the applicable contingency or fail to perform under the obligations within the specified time, buyer may, in this case, the seller, after first giving the notice to perform, required to obtain the cancellation right. So basically, what it says, that's a provision that allows the buyer an exit, right? Meaning that your protection is under paragraph 14, right? And part of that element is that it allows both mutually to agree to cancel if one of the parties don't ultimately perform, right? So in this in instance, right, our position is to get it to the finish line, right, as smooth as we possibly can. But we also have to understand our position that if the buyer or the seller doesn't perform, then the buyer or the seller have the right to cancel this agreement and then move on with another property, right? So in essence, don't demand a perfect buyer performance while your sellers hasn't met their contractual obligations, because they may be in a position as well. They're buying their purchase as well, and they have a condition which is not similar contingencies like the buyer has, but the seller also has contingencies that protect them from selling the property to your buyer. And if that contingency is not met, well, the buyer can send the seller the notice to perform. And if the seller cannot perform, the buyer has the right to cancel. Okay. Or if the seller has not provided us with disclosures, or the seller has made it very difficult for us to do our inspections, right? So there's many moving parts that it's not always the buyer It can also be the seller position that they're not performing as well. Failure to close escrow has its own procedure, right? So I hear this quite often. Simon, do I need to send a notice to perform because the seller hasn't been able to close? No, it's not the notice to perform, it's the notice of demand to close escrow, the DCE form. The performance issue remedy, okay, which is performance, okay, performance to release, but to not be able to close is the the DCE form. Two different distinguishes, two different forms involved in this position, right? So if you know that it's scheduled to close today, right? Then they don't close. You want to send this because that puts the seller in a position to perform, or that puts the buyer in a position to perform. Now, the differences and the distinguishes between the notice to perform and the demand to close is the performance element is 48 hours or 2 days, where the demand to close gives the buyer or the seller 72 hours or 3 days. Okay. So must give the other party at least 3 days after deliverance of the demand to close. Cannot be delivered earlier than 3 days. So the same element as the notice to perform. Now the question is, if today was the scheduled day to close, can I send the DCE 3 days prior? The answer is yes. Okay, so that way, if they don't perform today, you cancel today. Because if not, and you send the DCE today, that gives the buyer 3 days. So that means today would be 0 days, tomorrow will be 1, Sunday will be 2, and then Monday would be 3 days. And you know, escrows are not open till 11:59 p.m., right? They're probably open up till 5 or 6 p.m. That's kind of the end of day. You know, most likely they're going to be out of contract. The buyer or the seller have the right to cancel by that time. But you see the distinguishes of today canceling or Monday canceling. Because that might give that buyer leverage to push to the finish line, right? But again, communication is vital and important. Okay, after the DC period expires, cancellation must be in writing and signed by the cancellating party, right? So if the buyer can't perform the seller, then the next step would be is to cancel escrow and then put the property back on the market. Buyer has a contingency but does not close, right? Buyer still has loan contingency. The close of escrow arrives, loan isn't ready. Seller serves a DCE, 3-day period expires, seller cancels. Who gets the deposit? Okay. Who gets the deposit? It's right there. Let me repeat. Buyer still has loan contingencies. The close of escrow arrives, meaning today is the close of escrow. Loan isn't ready. Seller serves the notice demand to close of escrow. The 3-day period expires. Seller cancels. Who gets the deposit? I put this as a kind of a decoy. Okay. Do you think it's the seller that gets the deposit? You're right. The seller doesn't get the deposit. Okay. Because the buyer ultimately kept their loan contingency in place, right? Buyer did not release the loan contingency and wasn't able to perform. So therefore, can the seller cancel? Yes. But can the seller retain the buyer's deposit? No. Okay. No. I put this as a kind of a disclaimer to just kind of educate you to understand that it's not necessarily what you think, the black and white. Because I can argue the fact, well, I disagree on this. I think the seller is entitled to it. Okay, then tell me, why do you disagree with me? Because as I said earlier with the mediation, right? Even though we set the sellers in rightful to the deposit, that was not the case. Okay, that was not the case. Cancellation versus deposit release, right? Deposit release requires mutual signed release instructions or arbitration. Neither agent nor escrow holder are qualified to, it should be opinion on which party is entitled to the funds. Party should say qualified real estate counsel, right? So we're not attorneys. We don't give legal advice. We only base our information what is in front of us, right? At the end, it's really the buyer's decision, and we would encourage the buyer or the seller to seek legal counsel. It's recommended. It's okay. It's not a threat, but it's a better position that they're being guided by someone that has the expertise to advise them on legal matters. Okay, so never say, don't worry, you're definitely getting the deposit, right? Never say they defaulted, seller automatically gets the earnest money deposit. That's not the case. Because as you saw with the earlier deposit, we said the seller's entitled to it, but the proof in the pudding was that that didn't happen. They both mutually agreed to a 50-50 split, seller and buyer. This is exactly why you have to be careful and why agents get themselves in trouble. Before you send the notice to buyer to perform, the seller notice to perform, the demand to close escrow, stop and diagnose the situation, right? What exactly is wrong? Which RPA paragraph controls it? Has the scheduled performance date actually arrived? What does your client want? Performance or renegotiation? Maybe they're looking for something to renegotiate, right? And it may be a small thing or a big thing, right? But you just got to present what's in front of you and what your clients are asking of you. That's important. Can the problem be solved? And is the notice to perform actually the appropriate tool, right? So know that distinguishes that the notice to perform is not a demand to close. A demand to close is only when the scheduled close of escrow is not being performed on a timely manner. Okay. If you're unsure at any step, please make sure you speak with leadership. Promise you we're almost done. An extension strategy. Okay. Wait until the deadline, then fight. Identify what specific needs more time than aim to a contractual date that may be in writing. So don't be the agent that I'm going to wait and wing it until that deadline to release that contingencies. If you know you're not going to be able to perform 3 days, 5 days, I would suggest be proactive, call, email the agent and says, we're not going to be able to release that contingency. We're asking for an extension of time. And even though it's set in black and white and set in stone on what you agreed upon originally with the 17 days of contingencies, all of that is subject to change. Meaning I could say I'm good now, but 2, 3 days or a week from now, that may change. Know that, be proactive, call the agent, leave an email, and say we're going to need an extension of time to release the physical inspection, the appraisal, because one, we haven't received it yet. Two, we haven't finished our due diligence because it's been very difficult on my client's schedule. Whatever the case may be, have a compelling position on why you're asking for the extension of time to release a specific contingency. If the buyer needs 3 more days for sewer, termite, insurance, or underwriting, target written extension protects everyone, right? Be proactive. And this is why it's very important that you're in dialogue and communications with the listing agent, because when you need that extra time to release, you're in good terms with the agent, right? Instead of bad terms where they just shut you down, because the seller doesn't have to give you the extension. Know that. They don't have to. You agree to a certain specific date to release a condition, they can hold you accountable to that. Okay. So communication is crucial. Save the escrow. So let's just kind of real quick, a price point of $1.2 million. You have an active investigation contingency and loan contingency, appraisal contingency, right? Insurance. Inspection reveals a $25,000 sewer issue. Buyer requests a 20,000 credit. Seller comes back with a 5,000. And then the lender needs 4 additional days needed, right? Seller sends the notice to buyer to perform and cancel. Buyer, if seller doesn't give me the 20,000, I'm out. What would you do in this situation, right? So the essence is there's a lot of moving parts here, right? We need to get to the core of the circumstances to get to the bottom of what the buyer's motivation is. Because remember, it's asking a lot of questions will dictate what we need to do. Because again, the buyer's asking for $25,000, or in this instance, I should say, is 20,000, right? But excuse me, the seller, the buyer is asking for 25, but the seller is offering 20,000 as credit. And, ultimately, the seller comes down and says, no, you know what? I'm not going to give you 20. I'm not going to give you 15. I'm not going to give you 10. I'm just going to give you $5,000 towards the sewer inspection, right? So the elements, as I stated and mentioned to you, can go many, many different ways, right? You may throw everything in hopes that the seller gives you all that, but the essence is it's all negotiations as well. Okay. You throw this number, they throw this number, and then you ultimately come to an agreement that is mutually between buyers and sellers, that the buyer's happy and the sellers are good, and you continue with the process. But in this case, it may not go that way, right? The seller may say, I'm only going to give you 5,000. The property is being sold as is. I'm not going to give you any more than that. The buyer then has to make a ultimate decision if they want to continue. If not, they have every right to cancel. Does that make sense? Buyer agent, what do you do here? An investigation is still active. So has anything been removed? So remember, all of this will be crucial and vital depending on where your position is. Where are you in the process, right? Will dictate what you are asking. Because let's say that you release the physical inspection, and now you're asking the seller after you do your physical inspections, realize, oh my gosh, there's so many things that I missed. I'm going to ask the seller to do all of these repairs now by a request of repairs. The listing agent receives this like, wait a minute, they already released their physical inspection. So we already told them, the property's being sold in as is. And now we throw it back and says, no, we're not going to do any concessions whatsoever. You're buying the property as is. You release this as part of your condition. The buyer says, wait a minute, but I didn't know all of this stuff. Well, you release that physical inspection as part of your negotiations up in the very beginning. Seller doesn't have to entertain anything. They may do it in good faith, but the seller can hold their position and says, no, now the buyer cannot use this as leverage to cancel, says, well, because the seller's not giving me the necessary repair request, I'm going to cancel. Okay, we're going to go after your deposit. I've seen those circumstances say go that way too. Well, Simon, wait a minute, but the loan and the appraisal contingency are still in our position. Yeah, but the problem is we're not dealing with that, because if this wasn't an issue, you would still get the loan. But that's not the case here. You're arguing and trying to cancel based on um, uh, issues with the property. And therefore, you're using this as a reason for you backing out, which you can't, but the seller wants to challenge you because they feel that, your position is not relevant. You release that as part of your condition, and therefore you can cancel, but the seller's going to go after some of that money. And that might be the case. So be mindful. Be very mindful. And again, the last part of this is what will you do here, right? So if the position, again, it can go different directions in different situation, right? If we cannot come to an agreement, then the best approach for the seller is to relist the property, right? Put the property back on the market and ultimately try to find another buyer. But now you have new conditions, right? That now has to be divulged and disclosed to a new buyer. So let's say that the pre-existing buyer had all of these reports that were done, and now the buyer cancels. Now the burden of proof is you have new material issues regarding this property. You now have to divulge all of that information to the new buyer, right? And if you fail to do so, that could be a problem, right? So understand the elements of your approach and how you navigate this to make it a win-win, right? Because the goal here in today's topic is how do you survive or revive an escrow from canceling, right? So know the problem, know and understand the purchase agreement, understand the deadlines. What contingencies do we have? What contingencies have we released? And what does the client want, right? At the end of the day, maybe the client just decides they're out. They don't want it. We're done. We don't want them. Okay, then you know the proper channels of what you need to do. Can the situation or the problem be cured, right? What is the end goal? What other ways can we maneuver this to make it a win-win, right? Maybe it's the way you say it, how you tweak it, or be a good listener and you got the answer there, right? Know your extensions, know your negotiations, and know that if you have your arsenal, which would be as the cancellation is, okay, well, unfortunately, we cannot come to a meeting of the minds. We have no choice but to cancel, right? And everything must be documented, right? Because again, we just never know if this will ever come back to haunt us. We want to have all of our paperwork in play. Okay. So know contracts, know the deadlines, and know the client's objective, right? And then act on it. So without further ado, that concludes today's class. Any final questions? No questions? All right. Well, I definitely appreciate